I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Heads Up for Friday the 15th of May. We'll have Weekend Review for you, streamed from 4 o'clock today, and Heads Up will return 10 a.m. on Monday.
NBR Radio, Thursday the 14th. I'm John Stewart, and I'm joined by Nick Grant and Campbell Gibson for our weekly Look at the Media Watch. Now, Nick, first to you, and the Campbell Live ratings, how are they looking?
They seem to be looking pretty good, actually, John. I mean, now the internal review of TV3's Campbell Live, which was announced as its intention being to improve the commercial performance of the 7 p.m. time slot on weekdays, that was confirmed by MediaWorks on April the 10th, and as we know, that resulted in a massive spike in the current affairs show's audience. Though that was diagnosed by many pundits as a case of dead cat bounce, with the idea that, once the initial outrage had died down, so too would the audience decline. 25 instalments later, however, and Campbell Live is still consistently one of TV3's first or second highest rating programs every weeknight. Now, given the popular theory that it takes 3 weeks to develop a habit that sticks, there is the possibility that Campbell Live isn't a deceased moggy on temporary rebound, but actually a frisky feline with a spring in its step and a locked-in legion of loyal viewers.
Yeah.
But, which is causes an interesting conundrum for MediaWorks management, because on the one hand, it will make it increasingly difficult to axe the show, even though it's increasingly out of step with the rest of the channel's all singing or dancing entertainment ethos. On the other hand, can you think of there's ever been a more successful review where all you have to do is announce it to get the outcome that you want, improved ratings?
Yeah.
However, just one caveat to that, the idea that 3 weeks is all it takes to pick up a habit. I have actually looked at some more scientific studies, and it does seem that it takes about 60 days. So they've probably got a wee while to go yet before they're out of the woods, I think.
Now, looking at listening habits, Campbell, you've been having a look at the radio survey results. What are they showing up?
Yeah, so recently NZME has released some of its research, and there's a bit of history here, really. So they contracted a company called TNS, which is a research company, to basically just have a look at the radio market in Auckland, Christchurch and Wellington, and they released some of the research, and it was mainly consistent with previous surveys, and TNS has been doing these for 20 years, but the background here is that their contract to do these surveys expired late last year, and it's caused quite a bit of arguments in the industry, and the advertisers in particular are kind of annoyed because both MediaWorks and NZME, the two biggest radio players, have sort of struggled to collaborate on getting a new survey done, and they both agree on certain things. For example, that there should be a digital element to it, so instead of the paper diary method that they have, there should be a digital diary method as well. And there's sort of agreements and disagreements over how often the results should be released, but what's happened recently is the NZME survey that's come out has sort of been rejected by most of the media agencies, from what I understand, because they don't see it as completely robust and it's not completely opaque. So because MediaWorks didn't really agree on it, it's sort of coming from one company basically. And the issue here that the advertisers have is that NZME, because they're the ones seeing when the survey is done, they can run promotions for their radio networks, and that is inherently unfair for MediaWorks. But sometimes you don't know if that's happened.
Yeah, well, they are pretty deadly competitors, so little wonder that they're not cooperating on everything in this respect. Now, Nick, the Sky TV is planning to put its prices up ahead of the Rugby World Cup. Is that right?
That's right, John. It's been announced that for the cost of its basic and sport packages are going to go up mid-June. The cost of Sky Basic will increase by $1.15 and Sky Sport by $1.61, which means if you've got both packages, that's a 3.7% increase. Now that's the background to that is that Sky's first half results back in February, They showed a healthy increase in profit, up 13%. They did also report a $10 million increase in programming costs, up to $280 million, and that's the reason that's been given for pumping up the price for those two packages, though you could see it as a cynical move to take advantage of the enthusiasm that Kiwis obviously have for rugby and the Rugby World Cup.
Sorry, Nick, but also being cynical, you have to wonder whether they might drop the price back after the Rugby World Cup.
Yeah, well, that'll be interesting to see, because there's another thing that they need to offset as well, other than, and it's obviously the cost of programming is going up. But also in the last half, they lost a net of 8,707 subscribers. So they'll be trying to make up that lost revenue too. So I suspect once the price has gone up, it'll remain that way.
Yeah, as they usually do. Now, Campbell, finally, you have been doing a bit of spade work on this TVNZ decision to try to ditch its obligation to screen the general election political party addresses. What sort of progress have you made with your inquiries about that?
Yeah, they've tried to do it before back in 2012, and that didn't really go their way, and I wouldn't expect it to be changed anytime soon. I don't think this recent proposal is going to change anything. It seems like a thing they do after every election. Can we please remove these political addresses? They rate poorly, and people can get this information from the internet, basically. But since it's been rejected in the past, I don't think it's going to go through this time anyway. We ran a poll on this one, and we asked, does TVNZ still have the responsibility? Should it still have the responsibility to broadcast these addresses? And 67% of our readers said yes, and then the remainder said either no or the addresses shouldn't be done anyway. And TVNZ's argument, you can sort of understand it from where they're coming from. They now have commercial objectives for years. They've had it for decades now, and because these rate so poorly, you can see why they can say people can get this information from Parliament TV, or they can get this from the party's social media pages or something like that. But at the same time, they're still state owned, and you can see why these political addresses, since they only occur two programs every 3 years, it's 4 hours every 3 years, so it's sort of minimal.
Hardly going to put a big dent in their advertising
revenue. Yeah, exactly.
Revenue.
I can't. It's what they're going to get a few extra $1,000s from it. It's really minimal, but I guess for them, in some ways, it's sort of a moral argument in some ways, that they want to shake off this legacy of being a public broadcaster, and they are commercially driven. Like, what I found surprising was that when looking through their 2014 annual report, only 4% of their revenue comes from government grants. So they definitely, they're succeeding in their commercial
imperatives.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I think you said, Campbell, that those grants are actually part of the contestable fund that New Zealand On Air controls.
Yeah.
So they're competing with all the other commercial broadcasters for that as well. So it's hardly a handout as such.
And also, I wonder, does TV3 show these political?
No, they're not. They're not forced to.
They're not forced to. I realise, but you wonder if they volunteer.
Yeah, well, probably not. They'd be more concerned with The Bachelor and that sort of thing.
You can see some porcine pilots flying across the horizon before you see MediaWorks putting a hand up for that, I imagine.
Well, on that note, gentlemen, thank you very much, both of you, Nick and Campbell.
NBR Radio. With Hotel de Brett, your home away from home, but with better service. NBR Radio.
To Wellington, the weather and Transmission Gully. Train services in Wellington have been suspended until at least midday after more heavy rain battered the capital last night. All state highways are open, but officials are warning against any unnecessary travel. Weather reports show more rain on the way later today, but the weather warning has expired for Wellington and Kapiti. The severe weather has appeared to have claimed one life. Police say a man's body was found near a submerged car in Lower Hutt. Meanwhile, in Mount Maunganui this morning, locals have been hit by a tornado. There are reports of damaged homes, buildings, power lines and fences. Heavy rain and flooding have highlighted the need in Wellington for the planned Transmission Gully motorway. Wellington Employers Chamber of Commerce Chief Executive John Milford says alternative routes into Wellington City, as well as key infrastructure, are absolutely essential. Commuters in Wellington were warned against trying to get home as the highways and the train services were affected by the flooding, which caused 3-hour queues between the CBD and Lower Hutt. Mr Milford says extreme weather such as this highlights Wellington's need for the motorway. At 27 kilometres long and costing $850 million, the motorway, which would help to alleviate some of the traffic bottlenecks along the State Highway 1 coastal route, has been called the most talked about infrastructure project in New Zealand's history by former Transport Minister Jerry Brownlee. It would have provided Wellingtonians a safer way out of the city, something Mr Milford says is essential. He said alternative means and routes into the city and key infrastructure are absolutely essential in today's world. He adds this extreme type of weather is bound to have an effect on businesses in the region, but he says Wellington has a great ability to recover quickly. He said you only have to look at the previous 2 earthquakes to know how quickly we can get the city back on its feet. To Fonterra. As units in the Fonterra Shareholders Fund touch record lows, a cautiously optimistic research report from First New Zealand Capital is picking the stock to underperform while starting to look of interest. The NZX-listed fund, which offers an economic exposure to dividends from giant dairy cooperative Fonterra, is currently trading at about $5 a unit, well down on its float price in 2012 of $5.50. Analyst Ari Decker, head of institutional research at First New Zealand, issued a research note on May 13, giving a 12-month price target on the fund of $5.08. He said the performance of Fonterra, and by extension the listed fund, had not delivered on the expectations of investors when it floated. Mr Decker says while Fonterra has a clear strategy to increase its exposure to higher margin products, its business remains weighted to commodities. Due to the way the milk price is set, the margins from this are low and have been volatile as well. Its strategy was attractive, he said, but its ability to act on it was constrained by its access to capital. One of the fund's aims was to provide more capital to the co-op, but it was difficult to argue that Fonterra's balance sheet was much stronger as a result. Mr Decker said while Fonterra's earnings were forecast to increase, if they did not, its strategic options could be limited by rising debt. Mr Decker says as a cooperative, access to capital is limited, and this is currently placing pressure on the balance sheet at a time when investment is high to support growth strategy and earnings are challenged by volatile markets. Options to address that, if required, included retaining profits, selling non-core assets and raising capital. Mr Decker described the last option as difficult. Demand for units in the fund was high when it launched, but a bigger issue now might be that outside investors are no longer as attracted to putting capital into the cooperative. Changing the fund's structure to give outside investors a say on Fonterra's board might help, he said. Under the present system, the co-op is under the complete control of its farmer suppliers. In court news, Queen's Counsel Bruce Gray was powerless to stop Zespri as it sought further delays in a multi-million-dollar smuggling case. The lawyer, who's representing Shanghai Neuhoff, gently told the High Court at Auckland he can't point to any prejudice to his client if Zespri gets its latest application in the case. He said, but I'm here to say the defendant ought to be encouraged to get on with this case. Chinese kiwi fruit importer Shanghai Neuhoff was embroiled in smuggling offences with Zespri and launched a court action against it last June. The relationship between the parties broke down after 2012 when a Zespri subsidiary was charged with the under-declaration of customs duties in China and was fined the equivalent of $960,000. Shanghai Neuhoff general manager was sentenced to 13 years in prison, while the company was fined the equivalent of $7.6 million. The importer took action against Zespri, and its original claim was for more than $30 million for an alleged breach of its trade relationship with Zespri and wrongful termination of a contract. Zespri moved early to strike out the case, but last September, Justice Patricia Courtney said most of the claim can continue. Yesterday, Zespri's lawyer Bridget White says the statutory monopsony wants a review of discovery orders. Before Justice Ed Wiley, Ms. White said the costs of complying with the orders are oppressive, such as there being no date range for particular documents. She said, I have an intimate knowledge of the amount of documents, and for Zespri, a billion-dollar organisation to review it would be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of documents. She said Shanghai Neuhoff has given the impression the proposed orders were tailored. She said, in short, they are not. Mr. Gray said his client was not willing to consent to a halt of proceedings. He said it's trite to say the evils of delay are cumulative. This proceeding has been around for a long time, he said, and Zespri is doing everything it can to delay. It's applied to strike it out, recalled the strikeout decision, resisted discovery, and now reviews discovery orders. The plaintiff says, "You're just being evasive. Get on and provide discovery." The judge sided with Zespri and asked the registrar to find a day where a review of the discovery orders can be heard. Justice Ed Wiley told Mr Gray, "I'm going to order a stay in the interim as I think you realistically anticipated." Mr Gray told NBR Radio it was premature to comment on when the actual trial will be held.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform www.nbrtalent.co.nz.
NBR Radio, Thursday the 14th. I'm John Stewart. And today we're talking Auckland with the ACT MP for Epsom, David Seymour, and Mount Roskill's Labour MP, Phil Goff, who could also possibly be a candidate for the Mayor of Auckland. Now, the Council's transportation plan has drawn a lot of flack for various reasons. Among other things, it's been criticised for not properly addressing the congestion problems. Phil, what steps can be taken to address this issue?
Well, the basis of the congestion problem is that the population in Auckland has been increasing far faster than the capability of the infrastructure, either transport or housing for that matter, to cope with it. If you can't do anything or don't want to do anything about the rate of increase in population growth in Auckland, then you've got to provide the infrastructure that enables people to move around the city with ease and to be able to afford homes in the city. What we have to do, I think we've just about exhausted our potential for further motorway development. What we have to have is what every big city in the world has, and that's an effective public transportation system so that those for whom that is available can take the pressure off road congestion and take affordable, reliable and convenient transport in the public sector. I've just got back from New York. It's 2-3 times the size of New Zealand. I got around that city with absolute ease, not by using a private car, but because they had a decent public transport system.
So, David, what steps do you think should be taken to address the issue?
Well, I agree with Phil's basic analysis that Auckland is in a golden age. More and more people are coming here, and that leads to greater congestion. But I'd just make a couple of observations about the trends we see around the world. One is that as people become wealthier and technology gets better, the first thing they want to consume more of is space. So you go to New York, and it is very dense, because when New York was built, or at least the part on Manhattan Island was built, there was very little in the way of transport technology, and so people had to be close together, they had to live in small dwellings, and that's the way that New York is today. If you go outside of New York, outside of Manhattan, it's actually a very low-density city, ditto London. So the trend that we're going to see is actually greater consumption of space and lower density development over time, if the council will get out of the way. And I'll give you one more observation about what happens when councils try to densify cities. People do stop driving somewhat, but not to the same extent as the population density increases. So the council's mission to intensify the city will only lead to greater congestion and less mobility. That is the trend from around the world.
Well, can I just comment on that, John, because that's really interesting. I was at New York to attend the United Nations debate, but I also took time out to meet with New York City and talk to them about the very challenges that we're talking about on radio now. And they said the exact opposite has happened. New York, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I remember going to New York and people told me, don't ride on the metro. It's not safe. It's not reliable. They break down. Mayor Bloomberg came in. He applied some very effective private sector principles. He got the metro working. Now what they told me at the Department of Transportation, actually the trend is reversed. More people wanting to live on Manhattan. More people wanting to live in decent apartments as a lifestyle choice. Now, it's not my lifestyle choice. I like plenty of space around me. But for a lot of Aucklanders, if you provide decent accommodation and good services in the city, that's where they want to live. I've been down through the Beaumont Quarter. I've looked around at some of the new housing developments there. some of the most prized places to live in the city will be that high-density housing, as long as there's decent urban design and as long as we improve the facilities that exist in the central city. 10 years ago, you could fire a cannon down Queen Street after 10 o'clock at night and you wouldn't hit anybody. Now people are living in the city again, and I think we're going to see a reversal of that trend. Not for everybody. I don't want to live in an apartment, but there are a lot of New Zealanders, including a lot of international students here. Just one example I've been talking about this morning with the university, where people do want to live in the city. If you provide the accommodation there and it's affordable, that's what they'll choose. And
it's decent accommodation. I mean, I know in my days at TVNZ, which is right in the middle of the so-called Nelson Quarter, all you could see was a pile of of blocks made up of shoeboxes. They're tiny little apartments. And we'd want to avoid that, wouldn't we? Yeah, of course. But you look at the design. It's been advertised in the media recently for the new Wynyard Quarter. They are places that you'd really want to live. The west, the viaduct area. Those houses are fantastic. They fetch better prices than anywhere else. I don't want to see densification that chews into the lifestyle choice of New Zealanders. I don't want to see people who are quite happy on their small section facing a 10-storey apartment next to them. But there's plenty of scope for intensification, which, if done well, will lead to a high quality of life, and it won't be sought by people at the bottom of the heap. It'll be sought by people that can afford it and really do want to live in the city.
Could I just cut in there? I'm frightened at the extent to which I'm agreeing with Phil. I mean, he's right. Giuliani's cleaning up of New York was a spectacular thing, and if you stop mugging people, they will want to live there. That is true. I'm not sure what it says about the overall trend of where people would like to live. However, another thing that he's absolutely correct about is that the quality of urban design is critical. We look at things like, for instance, the train station or the development over Newmarket train station. I get feedback from people in my electorate who say we don't want more development like that. Whether or not that's fair, it is actually the perception of people out there. But there's actually a point at which you can't have it both ways. If you want to have, for instance, a city rail link, then you must have the intensification to feed it. And it's fascinating what they are doing with intensification around the Mount Eden station. They cannot intensify up on Newton because it's higher, it has heritage buildings, and it's in the Mount Eden view shaft. So instead, they are intensifying down in the valley from the top of Mount Eden Road down to where you start coming back up the hill to the village. And at that point, you have to ask yourself, is this an intense area looking for train service, or is it a train service looking for an intense area? So if you want to have particularly rail, then you're actually going to have to force some intensification, and that is why I think a lot of people are concerned about the real implications of this thing.
Well, what neither of you seems to be talking about is sprawl. In fact, going beyond the current city limits into the green fields.
Oh, well, we're happy to talk about that. I mean,
well, are you in favour, David?
Well, first of all, what is the definition of sprawl? The best definition that I've ever been able to find from anybody is that sprawl equals housing past mine. The truth is that Auckland has been growing for a very long period of time. It is not a low-density city. It is the densest in Australasia behind Sydney. And actually, there's not an enormous shortage of land in a country like New Zealand that is 0.7% intensified. So we've got to decide, are we prepared to have a rural-urban boundary that increases the price of land by a factor of 9, that's 2 kilometres inside the boundary versus 2 kilometres outside, when that leads to extremely high housing costs, leading to financial instability and inequality, frankly, an emerging paradigm where for the first time in New Zealand's history, whether or not kids buy homes is somewhat dependent on whether or not their parents got onto the property wave and can give them equity.
Now let's. Sorry, Phil, I interrupted.
Yeah. There's a couple of different questions in there. Look, I think you're going to have both greenfield and brownfield development as long as Auckland's population is going to increase by 250,000 people over the next 10 years. Neither one nor the other will solve it. Your problem with your greenfield development, of course, is the cost of infrastructure and the cost of people travelling from place to place. Now,
I was going to say it demands transport, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm one that I live in a rural location. I drive in.
Mount Roskill's
not
that rural.
On the motorway, and because of the development in places like Takanini, for example, each year I have found my journey to work getting longer, the roads getting more congested, and we're now, I think, we're one of the most congested. We're out of the top 300 cities, we're about 41st most congested city in the world. Now, how does that affect us? Well, it affects us because it causes frustration and a waste of time. But I've got two sons. They both work in the trades area. One's a small businessman. He runs his own business. He's now spending up to 2 hours a day travelling, and the way that we will have to deal with it is having things like the City Rail Link. That will double the capacity of our rail link to bring people in and out of the city. That'll help the west. That'll help the south. In my area here of Mount Roskill, we don't have a rail link. We have buses, and they say that we've now got bus congestion coming into the area up Simon Street, and what we need is light rail. You know, ironically, I'm just old enough to remember the trams. They were abolished. You won't remember them, David. They were abolished, but the light rail proposals are to use exactly the same routes, and it'll help your electorate in Epsom as it'll help my electorate in Mount Roskill, so that you can increase the capacity of people to get from their home to their work in a quick and efficient and reasonably cheap manner. And we need that.
Light rail.
We face choices here, but can I just come in about, it is an important thing that we have finite resources. We have to make choices. So the City Rail Link will be very expensive. Yes, it will double rail. But from around about 3% of trips to around about 6%. So, it's a very expensive proposition. And as Phil says, it actually won't help many parts of the city. Interestingly enough, there will be a very large number of stops within the Epsom electorate that are helped, but I'm not sure that's best for Auckland. The question is, how do we ration or make choices about infrastructure development? And ultimately, we have a choice between either pricing things accurately and letting consumers decide where to live, where to work, how much travel to use, or we have a central planning approach, which is what the council favours, where they draw lines on maps and say, thou shalt not build beyond this. I favour pricing because it's more efficient.
So let's shift our focus to the Resource Management Act. Now, David, you say we need a complete reform. Phil, what's your perspective?
Well, I think there are areas of the Resource Management Act that can be improved, but I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The Resource Management Act was brought in to replace, I think, something like 59 other statutes, and it picked up the trend that's been happening worldwide, that development and the environment aren't two conflicting and opposing ideals. You need both of them. You need development, but you need development in a sustainable way. And I think the concern, including the concern among some of the government's support parties, though maybe not the ACT party, was that again it was going to be a short term. Let's have development. Let's put environment behind that. But I know what the people in my electorate would feel if we said, okay, we're going to gut the Resource Management Act, and if somebody wants to build a 10-storey apartment next to your place and cast shade and interrupt your privacy, how would you feel about that? And they'd say, we want a Resource Management Act. We want to be able to protect our rights and our style of living. So what I'd do with the Resource Management Act, I'm more than happy to sit down with the government and hear what their proposals are about changing the Resource Management Act so that we can remove some of the unnecessary red tape and we can get the best practice and the fastest procedures. That's fine. Look, let's put it on the table. Let's look for a cross-party consensus about the sensible changes that are being made. But let's not pretend
the problem
for a moment that you can gut the Resource Management Act and not have profound effects on people's rights over their own property and the nature of the environment that we live in.
The problem is there, though, Phil, that we've heard very little from from Nick Smith about just what
that is
his
the problem.
plans are for this complete reform.
Yeah.
But anyway...
I couldn't agree more with you, John. Look, we're getting too much politics in this. We're getting... And Nick is... I've known Nick for a long time. He's particularly good at overstating a case, creating panic, and then getting people's backs up. What we need is to say, let's have an evidence-based approach. What are the areas that we could change that would get agreement, I think, across most of the House on, where we can make that Resource Management Act work better? It's not a case of slowing things down. It's a case of maintaining people's right to be consulted, to participate, to have input, to help determine the decision. But that doesn't have to take 10 years. And, look, I know there are a lot of things that are irritants in the Act that could be improved. But part of the change to the Act ought not to be to gut its fundamental principles in Section 6 and Section 7 of the Act. That's tried and tested.
So, David, would you like to respond to Phil's thoughts on the RMA?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're arguing matters of degree here. I think that the environment is very important, and when I think about the environment, I think about science. When I think about science, I think about physics, chemistry, and biology. So yes, air, water, and soil purity is important. Yes, biodiversity is important. And yes, the physical things, noise, shading, traffic, those are all things that my constituents are very, very concerned about, and we see it with intensification and development in the Epsom electorate. But notice that you can be concerned about those things without many of the other, frankly, woolly so-called principles that have grown into the RMA like barnacles in a ship over the last 24 years that we've had the thing. For example, in Section 7 you are required to account for the intrinsic values of ecosystems. Now, by definition, you cannot know what the intrinsic values are. Nonetheless, that's something councils have to account for. You have to make allowance for the efficient end use of energy. Now, hang on a minute. There's no market failure here. People already have very strong incentives to conserve energy, but that is another thing that councils must consider when making their plans. So we have given both a requirement and an alibi to council planners to impose their designs upon Aucklanders in particular. That is why we have an inelastic supply of housing. That is why we have a housing market that is dysfunctional.
No. Well, look, see, this is where I disagree. I think that what Nick Smith and National are doing is saying, look, reform the RMA, and that will solve all of our problems with the housing crisis in Auckland. Look, it may help in some respects, but it doesn't touch on the fundamentals of why we've got a problem with housing in Auckland. One of the problems we've got with housing in Auckland, the RMA is the same RMA that existed back in 2003 when the rate of building in Auckland was twice the level that it was now. It didn't slow down building then. It's not the major cause. The major cause, and this is where, again, probably David and I have different ideas, is that because of the cycle of housing demand and the fact that, for a period of time, the housing numbers were way down and the building industry was reduced in its capacity, etc., we haven't been building enough houses probably for the last 6 or 7 years now. What we've got is huge demand and an incapacity of the building industry to be able to respond to that in the proper way. And that will not be resolved simply by changing the RMA. It will be resolved with a whole lot of interventions. And, I'm one that applauds the Reserve Bank intervention yesterday to say, hey, one of the reasons why in my electorate, which, large parts of it used to be owner-occupied, and when I go around and I visit the homes there now, people are renting, not because they want to be renters, but because they're priced out of the market.
Indeed.
One of the reasons they're priced out of the market is that over 40% of the house purchases in Auckland now, and probably higher in my electorate, are by property investors against whom the first home purchaser simply cannot compete. The loan-to-value ratio was imposed on low-income earners and stopped them getting into the market, opened up the opportunity for investors to buy more of the houses. What the Reserve Bank has done now, not taking into account foreign investment in existing residential, is probably knock out some of the local investors, but still allow in people that are drawing money from overseas and people living overseas who never intend to come and live in New Zealand. There's not one single answer to the housing crisis in Auckland. There is a particular pattern of things that need to happen, a group of changes that need to be made, and we need to work on all of those fronts if we're to restore the Kiwi dream to a whole lot more New Zealand families.
Well, finally and very briefly, I'll get both of you to shift your gazes back to the past and the fourth Labour government, which is something that both of you are quite familiar with. Well, whether it was your finest hour, we'll leave history to judge, Phil, but you were a cabinet minister.
I'll remember it better than David. That's a fact. Look, I think we came in. I remember very clearly the first cabinet meeting we held. It was before we were even sworn into office. And we had Bernie Galvin from the Treasury and we had Rod Dean from the Reserve Bank, and they both spelt out what 6 years of Muldoonism, tight regulation, and a range of things that, once upon a time in the 1930s a government might have seemed appropriate did to the New Zealand economy. And what we did in those years was actually not so much radical change, but simply to return New Zealand to the form of economic orthodoxy that existed in other places in the world.
So Phil,
farmers to breed fat lambs that we couldn't sell, for example.
Sure.
That's not rocket science. That's common sense.
So can I just ask you briefly, just to give me a one-word answer, do you think that regime, that fourth Labour government, was a positive or a negative thing for New Zealand?
Oh, I think it was positive, and that's shown by the fact that most of the changes we made during the 1980s remain in place today, and governments of both colours wouldn't dream of altering them.
And you, David?
Well, could I just say I would love to have a lash at Phil's lecture on the RMA a moment ago, but I'll spare everybody that. I think he's wrong on a number of areas. The main one is that while the RMA is not the fix-all for the housing market, it is one piece of legislation that the central government has responsibility for. Insofar as the government from 84 to 90, it was a bit more than Phil said. It was radical. It's taken New Zealand from being middle of the road in terms of economic freedom, and by that I mean sound money, freedom to trade, flexible labour markets, low taxes, size of government, etc., to being number 3 in the world consistently for the last 20 years. The only countries with freer economies than us, Hong Kong and Singapore, and you can argue whether they're fully functioning democratic countries. So it was radical. It took us all the way, and I would hazard, if I could be a little bit rude, that a lot of the Labour Party's current difficulties, that they haven't properly come to terms with that and how successful it's been. They've tried to roll it back in various ways, and the people of New Zealand have said, no, we're actually very happy with being the freest economy in the democratic world.
There's only one thing wrong with that.
I'm sorry, Phil.
We had 9 years in government and we didn't reverse those changes. It's not that we didn't believe in them. A lot of those changes made absolute sense and the country was better off for
them.
Well,
precisely, and you won 3 elections on that basis. It's the last 3 elections I'm talking about.
Last word to David there. We're over time, gentlemen, and we'll have to wrap it up. But
cheers,
Phil Goff,
okay.
Phil Goff and David
John,
Seymour, thank you very much.
Thank you,
pleasure being on the program.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.
What's in today's National Business Review? Tim Hunter reports on a former mafia lawyer in Florida who's emerged as an advisor to a New Zealand businessman who listed his company in Frankfurt. Rob Hosking writes a global trigger involving anything from US interest rate rises to a Greek government default could upset New Zealand's over-indebted economy. But what does the Reserve Bank think? Sally Lindsay says Auckland Mayor Len Brown is expected to be asked next week to start work on a joint government and council revised transport plan. Prime Minister John Key and Transport Minister Simon Bridges have rubbished the just-finished Auckland Transport Plan and say the council needs to get realistic about providing public transport and roading. Shoeshine wades into the debate over what value to attribute to fast-growing technology companies that probably won't be profitable for years to come. Calila Smiley finds Christchurch hydro turbine designer Hydroworks is forming ambitious growth plans, gearing up to launch onto the stock market after clinching a strategic acquisition. All this and more in today's National Business Review, out now. While you were sleeping, Wall Street rose after better-than-expected jobless claims data and an unexpected decline in producer prices suggested the US economy is growing at a pace that's unlikely to warrant an interest rate increase soon. In late trading in New York, the Dow Jones Industrial Average added 0.98%, the S&P 500 climbed 1.01%, and the Nasdaq advanced 1.29%. Also helping stocks was a gain in US Treasuries, stemming a recent run-up in bond yields globally. Gains in shares of Microsoft and those of Apple, both up 2.3% recently, led the Dow higher. The Dow rose as high as 18,254.37, inching closer to its record high. A Labour Department report showed initial claims for state unemployment benefits unexpectedly declined, falling 1,000 to a seasonally adjusted 264,000 for the week ended May 9. Separately, the Labour Department's Producer Price Index for final demand also posted a surprise drop, declining 0.4% in April. The data added to recent evidence, such as Tuesday's disappointing retail sales report for April, that there's little pressure on the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates in the immediate future. In Europe, the Stoxx 600 finished the session with a 0.6% increase. The UK's FTSE rose 0.3%, France's CAC 40 added 1.4%, and Germany's DAX rallied 1.8%. To private equity, the NZX listings of Scales Corp, Metro Glass and Orion Health by their private equity owners was a major factor in a record year for mid-market PE and venture capital deals, as measured by accounting firm EY for the New Zealand Venture Capital Association. The 14th annual Private Equity and Venture Capital Monitor publication, published this week, shows the total value of investment and divestments in the mid-market valuation range was $243.5 million compared to $191.3 million in 2013 and rivaled only in 2011 when deals worth $223 million were recorded. Citing the partial listing of Scales Corp and Orion Healthcare by Auckland PE investors Direct Capital and Pioneer Capital respectively, and the NZX listing of Metro Glass involving Australian PE investor Crescent Capital, the report says the average deal size across the 19 transactions considered was $12.8 million, also a record for the survey, which was first conducted in 2003, and mid-market divestment activity increased significantly in 2014 to its highest ever levels, driven by IPOs. Direct Capital and Pioneer Capital have retained shareholdings post-listing, the report says. The outlook for 2015 promises further IPO opportunities for portfolio companies. At 62 transactions and a total deal value of $55.8 million, investment and divestment at the small capital, venture capital end of the market was similar to the previous year, with totals fluctuating significantly from year to year. There were no large company buyouts during the year, whereas in 2013 transactions at the large end of the PE market totaled $210 million and included AMP Capital's purchase of a stake in PowerCo. The survey results are not comprehensive, and the authors acknowledge awareness of other transactions. It draws on a survey of 12 New Zealand and Australian private equity and venture capital firms. Commenting on investor sentiment, the report shows unusually low levels of investment in biotech ventures, although the sector remains a top area of interest along with food and beverage plays. IT, which accounts for the lion's share of activity in 2014, appears to have polarised fund managers, the report says. Fund managers have a relatively pessimistic view of the manufacturing and media communications sectors, it says.
NBR Radio with Bayleys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.
NBR Radio, Thursday the 14th. I'm John Stewart. The supermarket duopoly run by Foodstuffs and Countdown is accused of many things. One is that they sell expensive groceries. Another is that they force lower prices on suppliers and producers. In his editor's insight on Thursday, Neville Gibson says big changes are occurring in the supermarket business. Neville, what is the state of the industry?
Well, contrary to a lot of perceptions, it's getting tough and it's likely to get tougher, but the industry's responding by hiring some top talent. In fact, it could become one of the glamour industries of the future. The problem they've got is that we've got a very low inflation rate, not just in New Zealand, but all around the world, and this is squeezing everyone. It means producers, suppliers and retailers can't increase their prices, increase their margins. And the evidence is in the latest food price index, which came out I think yesterday, and the grocery category, because you've got to take meat and fish and vegetables, that sort of thing, out of some of these calculations because their prices are driven by the market. But when you're looking at the grocery category, it's fallen 1.5% in the past year. And if you look at April alone, they were down 0.9%, and this was mainly due to discounting by supermarkets and things like snack food, sauces, biscuits and so on. Bread and milk are items that have come down dramatically in price. This started in Australia where they were selling milk for $1 a litre, and bread got down to, it's now below $1 a loaf. In fact, you can buy it, pack and save one for 95 cents. And so the industry is really finding it pretty tough to grow its business and increase their margins and increase sales overall.
There were a lot of allegations last year about unfair practices. What came of those?
Well, the pressure from the supermarkets to get prices or get them down from suppliers was enough to spark investigations into the tactics on both sides of the Tasman. The one here fizzled out pretty quickly, went through Parliament and was the issue was raised by Shane Jones, as everyone knows. But in Australia, they take this thing pretty seriously, and their main regulation body over there is keeping a very close eye on what's going on. In fact, last month, Coles, which is one of the two big supermarket chains in Australia, was fined $2.5 million, which admittedly is small for the size of the company, but it's pretty big money if you just one particular fine. And this was for falsely advertising bread in its stores as being freshly baked or baked today, when in fact it was made from dough that came all the way from Europe. So frozen, of course. The competition over there is also quite public because Coles is part of a bigger company called Wesfarmers, and Woolworths runs the other chain, and these are under a lot of analysis from the share market analysts. Their share prices get knocked around if they don't boost their margins. But in New Zealand, Countdown's part of Woolworths, so we know what their figures are. And in general terms, they aren't doing that well.
Well, if the sales and margins are declining, what are they doing about it?
Well, their response is actually just take out more costs from their own operations and put more squeeze on the suppliers. In fact, the shoppers need to know that they're going to get even cheaper goods. But of course, what happens is that when some goods get quite cheap, people go and spend a bit more on some more expensive items. And they're not stupid, the supermarkets. They know what people do. But in Australia, for example, Woolworths has introduced quite a tough program there, and it's going to be run by a New Zealander, Dave Chambers, who's been sent across or recruited across from Countdown, and he's now going to be running a whole Australia-New Zealand supermarket operation. So there's going to be quite a few changes there. They call that lean retail. Meanwhile, on the other side of the coin, the supplier companies, led by Lion, the big Japanese brewing company, but in Australia, Lion is a huge supplier of dairy products and drinks and so on. They're saying, if we're going to give you lower prices for our goods, we want more shelf in the supermarket. So there's a real standoff still occurring. But in overall terms, if you look carefully and buy, good, quality, not so much high price goods, but buy the right sort, you should be better off.
Now, in Australia, you hear a lot about the cheap Aldi supermarkets. That's Aldi spelled A-L-D-I, not like the car. Now, are Aldi likely to come here?
Yeah, people keep asking me about this one. It's a bit like IKEA. When are they going to come here? These are Aldi's quite a strange company, really, very secretive, I might add. It's huge. It has $70 billion US dollars sale, and it's run by one family, but it's split in two geographically. So the Aldi in Australia is part of one group of Aldi, and then in Germany there might be another. But they have quite a different model to our supermarkets, which tend to get bigger and bigger and offer more things and have lots of fresh fruit and vegetables. Aldi runs exactly the opposite. They are about half the price of a normal supermarket, but they run mainly groceries. You won't get any brands. They have their house brands, but a lot of these are made in New Zealand, like their muesli bars and that sort of thing. And they've been doing extremely well in Australia with these quite limited supermarkets with cheap goods, not a lot of fresh produce, that sort of thing. They started off in Australia in 2001. They got about 370 stores. They're now aiming for 500, and that's going to be done by spreading their operations out of the eastern states, that's New South Wales, Victoria and New South Wales, to South Australia and Western Australia. But who knows, if they get big enough, they might tack New Zealand on. So it's one of those questions of wait and see.
Well, the big news this week was Foodstuffs hiring an outsider as chief executive. Just finally and very briefly, what's behind this?
Well, he's Chris Quinn, and this might come as a surprise to a lot of people that you get an outsider of his talent. He's from Telecom, Spark and GNI, very well known in the IT business. But the thing about Foodstuffs and Countdown as well is they're now more heavily dependent on technology, understanding the shopper. That requires analytics, and of course they face a big challenge as well from people who are now buying their groceries online and from services like My Food Bag. So you can expect to see at both Countdown and the Foodstuffs chains that there's going to be a big emphasis in future on technology and how it's going to benefit the consumer in the end.
Neville, thanks very much for today's Editor's Insight.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
I'm Grant Walker with Heads Up. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. TPP breakthrough in the US. We look at the real reasons Sky TV hiked prices. Well, in our opinion. MYOB's online strategy. F&P Healthcare scoops award. Last year was a record one for mid-cap private equity deals. And that Wellington weather. Proof of the need for Transmission Gully. If you're travelling today, Auckland heavy showers. Wellington more wet weather coming. Christchurch fine then wet. And Dunedin a bit wet. To find out more on our stories, log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio. To the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The proposed TPP has been beaten up in the media and by people within the US government, but the deal's critics are little better than scaremongers, according to an international arbitration expert, Gary Bourne. The stuttering free trade agreement, which would involve 40% of the world's markets, experienced a significant blow this week from the US government, but the deal desperately needs support when so many people across the Asia-Pacific will benefit. To pass the TPP, US President Barack Obama needs the US government to pass the so-called fast track. This authority would allow Mr. Obama to submit the TPP to the US Congress for a simple yes or no vote without amendments. Although TPA was expected to pass this week, Democrats in the US Senate voted against giving Mr. Obama the authority without significant concessions in return, while demanding the TPP reaches a higher quality. The refusal to allow TPA is a setback, but there will be another vote for the authority in the next few weeks. Mr. Obama will now be organising greater support from the Democrats as chief negotiators for the TPP readdress the details of the pact. Mr. Bourne, currently visiting New Zealand's Victoria University, is widely recognised as a leading figure in the international arbitration community. He says the TPP represents an enormous good for large corporations, entrepreneurial individuals and employees in the 12 TPP member countries. Unfortunately, the media debate surrounding the gigantic deals gets muddled, he says, by politicisation and mischaracterisation of the secret negotiations as good versus evil or big companies against little employees. The reality is, he says, it's exactly the consumers and employees who will benefit most. They and their relatives who are business people and investors will gain from the rule of law this pact provides. He went on, there is fair room for debate about the nature of the procedural mechanisms and also about the exact scope of the substantive legal protections. But the way to deal with this is not to throw out the rule of law, it's to adopt laws that protect the state's regulatory interests and private citizens' own legitimate property rights. To Sky TV. They have announced yesterday it's increasing the cost of a basic sports package for residential customers. The increases, which kick in June 15, bump the basic cost by $1.15 to $49.22 and sport by $1.61 to $28.29. That represents a 3.7% increase for households with a subscription to both packages. The local Twitterati have been quick to dub the increases a cynical piece of price pumping before the Rugby World Cup September kick-off. First New Zealand Capital's Ari Decker isn't buying that interpretation, however, noting that Sky's pricings is regularly adjusted for inflation. He also points out that Sky's programming costs are constantly increasing. The half-year report, for example, noted an increase of 10 million to 280 million, which is the reason the Sky spokeswoman has given for the package's price bump. Mr. Decker says there are more rights available because of online rights and more competition for rights. So when they're spending more money on programming, as long as they feel comfortable they're delivering sufficient value to their customers, they'll be looking to recover some of those cost increases. Mr. Decker is of the view the sports package actually delivers a lot of value in any case. He says that's just because of the way they construct their pricing at the moment. In a lot of respects, he says the sports package is priced at its cost, and the basic is kind of like, in an old telco sense, the equivalent of a line fee where they get the margin, the infrastructure they've got invested, the corporate overhead and that sort of stuff. So they choose, he says, to price a basic price at a certain level, and sports and movies they essentially charge on the basis that it recovers the cost. Now, he says, a quite different approach to pricing would be to bring the basic down and then charge more and get margin in the sports package, for example. He went on, there are lots of different ways you could dice it, but to get back to the core of it, that price increase doesn't seem significantly out of line with what they've done over a long period of time. Some years, he says, they don't change the pricing of one of the products, and occasionally they do a switch. For example, at one point they made the sport more expensive and brought the basic down a chunk. So it's not the same every year, but broadly over time they're recovering in the range of a 1 to 2% price increase. It might be a bit higher this time because they didn't put it through last year, so it might be higher or might just be catch-up. The past 3 annual reports support Mr. Decker's point. In 2012, the increase for the basic and sports combo was 3.1%. In 2013, it was 1.3%, and 2014, 1.9%. In business news, MYOB Group, the Australian payment solutions software developer that floated on the ASX this month, says it's confident its move to online products has been nimble enough to protect market share from upstart rivals such as Xero. The Melbourne-based company has shifted its focus from desktop software to web-based services to head off the challenge from cloud-based rival Xero, which has seen its fastest growth in MYOB's main markets of Australia and New Zealand. Chief Technology Officer Simon Rake-Allen told an Institute of IT Professionals event in Wellington yesterday the strategy will ensure the company retains its dominance. To meet the demands of the new environment, MYOB had to throw out its old model of 6 monthly or annual updates to its products, become more nimble in the way it services customers, and place greater emphasis in capturing the growing acceptance of web-based software. MYOB is now at the end of its rapid change, with about 67% of customers now using its online services. Mr. Rake-Allen said, we're somewhere in the zone of change right now. We're in simplify mode now, bringing down the complexity. MYOB listed on the ASX this month, raising 833 million Australian as Bain Capital sold down its stake in the firm. The shares recently traded at $3.65, the same price the shares were sold at the IPO. Rake-Allen said the company had tested the online waters in 2001, but decided against pursuing that after a survey of customers showed they were lukewarm about the move. He said, maybe we put too much credibility on that survey. When Wellington-based Xero started gaining traction, that was one of the factors that forced MYOB's hand in making the change. Xero took out full-page ads in newspapers across Australia and New Zealand, heralding the death of MYOB, which seized on them to help motivate staff to embrace change, Mr. Rake-Allen said. MYOB's strategy to fuel future growth is to focus on cloud-based systems, having spent 100 million Australian over the past 3 years on research and development to support the shift away from desktop products, according to the company's prospectus. The prospectus said MYOB's strategy is to continue to focus on being a leading provider of cloud-enabled business management software solutions in Australia and New Zealand. MYOB will seek to maximise the benefits of cloud solutions to generate greater penetration and usage of cloud products and grow customer lifetime value and average revenue per paying user. Mr. Rake-Allen said the company is also continuing to bolster its product offering with extensions such as the mobile payments application PayDirect and its recent deal with US firm OnDeck, whose platform helps facilitate small business loans, which will be available to Australian small and medium-sized enterprises later this year.
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant now offering Auckland's most exclusive private dining room. NBR Radio.
NBR Radio, Thursday the 14th. I'm John Stewart, and I'm joined by NBR's news editor, Duncan Bridgman, to talk about the markets. So, Duncan, what's happening today on the 14th?
John, in general, the New Zealand share market has been buoyed by the prospect of lower interest rates as the Reserve Bank looks to keep economic growth ticking along. But it's a bit of a balancing act for it, given that it doesn't want to add more fuel to the Auckland housing market. So, as we saw yesterday, it turned to other methods and announced some new lending restrictions on residential property investors. So, attention remains focused on whether or not it will keep interest rates on hold, or it might actually cut interest rates. And we've seen the dividend-paying stocks, like the electricity companies, for example, having gained ground as a result. Today, those have been a bit soft. There's been a poor performance on Wall Street overnight on renewed worries that the US growth, or about US growth, are sort of after some disappointing economic data.
What were those economic data which scared the horses?
Well, it's US jobs, consumer sentiment, and GDP actually show that the US economy is recovering from its weakness, but not quite at the pace that might compel the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates in short time. Right now, investors are kind of waiting for inflation data to give a bit more of an indication on that.
Now, we've had a couple of interesting company announcements.
Yep, Newplex came out and lifted its guidance for the full year earnings. This is on the back of strong performance in Europe, growth in Asia, North American markets, and also closer to home in Australia and New Zealand. So it's performing really well. And that EBITDA growth that it's talking about, that earnings growth, could be in the range of up to 23% in Europe and Africa and the Middle East, compared to a year earlier. And it's looking at 15 to 20% earnings growth in Asia, and here at home, 23 to 28% lift in earnings. So Newplex is certainly benefiting from the current cycle, and so that's one to watch. We also had Diligent Board Member Services came out yesterday with that was Tuesday, with a bit of a mixed result. It showed first quarter earnings were up by 14%, but the cash flow that it generated in the quarter actually fell slightly after some delays in invoicing as the company switches to a new system. It produces board books, which is a sort of corporate governance product for which can be used online.
And Duncan, what can we expect from company results in the next few days?
Yep, I think analysts are forecasting strong earnings per share growth across most of the other companies that they follow, although there are strains in some sectors that are starting to show. For example, the agriculture sector with lower dairy prices, they may have an impact. We'll get more insight tomorrow when Trustpower reports, and the week after, or next week, Ryman Healthcare comes out, so that'll be interesting. I think companies have pretty flexible balance sheets right now, and in a position to grow or return capital to shareholders. So, be keeping an eye on the dividends, and also forecasts are also important.
You have seen some sectors that are struggling, though?
Well, I think agriculture is one, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And Fonterra's kept its forecast payout down, and it looks like we could be in for another year of lower milk price payout. So that will rub through to the economy. People talk about 6 to 7 billion out of the economy there. So that's less money that farmers will be spending on other things. that being said, I think the drought may have influenced some farmers to buy things like stock feed, and that may benefit the likes of PGC Wrightson. But these things can be offset by other factors. So it's certainly a bit of there are some headwinds in that sector.
Indeed. Well, thanks very much for this week's Look at the Markets, Duncan.
NBR Radio. Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
TPP breakthrough. A measure to give President Barack Obama the power to ease trade pacts through Congress cleared a procedural hurdle in the Senate and reversed a blocking move earlier this week. The move was 65-33 on taking up a fast-track bill that would also renew a program that helps workers hurt by trade talks. Republicans joined forces with pro-trade Democrats to advance the bill, overcoming opposition from Liberals who want to block new trade deals. The most important of these is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. 60 votes were needed for the bill to clear this first procedural hurdle. Fast Track Authority, which has been suspended since 2007, gives the President the power to submit trade deals to Congress for an up or down vote without amendments. The final Senate vote on Trade Promotion Authority and an associated bill renewing the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program aimed at assisting workers hit by trade deals is expected next week. Let's look at Europe. Doom or gloom? That's the question on the lips of Europe watchers and analysts around the world. Although it's been a topic of contention for the better part of 5 years, the debate was reheated last week after internationally recognised economic analyst and author Jonathan Payne outlined why we should all buy Europe. Happy days are here again, he said, adding that the Eurozone is showing signs of bouncing back. The self-proclaimed most positive Europe analyst in the world told an Auckland audience last week the combination of low inflation, low oil prices and banks' willingness to lend money again are all pieces of the puzzle that will make Europe blossom. Despite Mr Payne's optimism, only a third of NBR poll participants agreed Europe was about to bloom. New Zealand Initiative Executive Director Oliver Hartwich is not at all surprised at the result. In fact, what did throw him was the third of respondents thinking positively about Europe. He says he was surprised by Mr Payne's position as he thought there was consensus that Europe was a basket case. He says, the business people I talk to say Europe is a no-go zone, at least for economic growth, and you wouldn't really expect any great economic stimulus coming for a while. Although Greece officially entered into a recession this week, the rest of Europe had some positive results. Europe's economy grew 0.4% in the first quarter of this year, with Germany, Italy, France and Spain all showing positive growth numbers, the first time this has occurred since 2010. But Dr. Hartwich still has his doubts. He said, I think Europe is still doomed. If you look at German bonds, for example, 70% of Germany's debt papers are now recording negative interest rates. Europe, no matter how you look at it, is facing problems on a number of fronts. Some 66% of poll participants say Europe is doomed, leaving the remaining 34% to remain positive about the continent's future, much to Dr. Hartwich's surprise. It's awards time. Fisher & Paykel Healthcare took home a couple of big prizes last night at the Institute of Financial Professionals in New Zealand, or INFINS Awards. It won the Best Corporate Communicator for Market Leaders, and its Chief Executive Mike Daniel took the Leadership Award. Abano Healthcare won the award for Best Communicator among emerging leaders. Devon Funds Management was Fund Manager of the Year. First New Zealand Capital was Sharebroking Firm of the Year. And Stephen Ridgewell at Craig's Investment Partners was Research Analyst of the Year. Vista Group's $92 million float, of which $40 million was new capital, was judged the year's best equity issue, while the $223 million takeover of Synlait Farms was the transaction of the year.
NBR Radio with the Property Press. It's out now to show you around.